From the Radio Cafe and the Quivira Coalition, you're listening to Down to Earth, the Planet to Plate podcast. I'm your host, Mary Charlotte Domandi. This is a program about regenerative agriculture and the many different paths people are taking to fix our broken food system, restore soil, and mitigate climate change. And today we're going to be talking to an incredibly creative ranch manager who has a lot to say about the California floods and the role that soil can play in preventing these kinds of major disasters. But first I want to thank our latest donors on Patreon, Anna Heiniger, Christopher Prandoni, and Elizabeth West. Thank you all so much for your contributions, and also Synergia Ranch, who are themselves a terrific example of great organic farming. If you want to support the program too, which would be wonderful, and you can do it for just a couple bucks a month, you can go to patreon.com/down-to-earth-planet-to-plate. And Patreon is spelled Patreon. We're talking today to Mark Biaggi. He's ranch manager at TomKat Ranch, which is an 1,800-acre cattle ranch south of San Francisco. This land, which is very steep grassland, has been under various kinds of human management for literally thousands of years, from indigenous people who used fire as a management tool to the farming and grazing of later colonizers who were doing agriculture that included dairy, beef cattle, and crop farming. Tom Steyer and Kat Taylor bought the ranch in 2002, and for the last 12 years they've been doing both grass-fed beef production and research and monitoring of the land with a focus on regeneration. The ranch has also been a learning lab where people interested in regenerative agriculture can come together and learn from one another. Welcome, Mark Biaggi, to Down to Earth.
Thank you.
So you have kind of a rainy season and a dry season. What's that like, and how do you manage for water to minimize either excess or deficiency of water in the soil?
We're a Mediterranean climate.
What does that mean?
It means that your rainy season comes in the cool months and it's dry during the warm months. So it's a little bit of a flip side, might say, of continental weather pattern. And it's traditionally said about California that we're more Mediterranean than the Mediterranean, thinking about, say, Spain, Italy, Greece. We traditionally do not get any rain for 6 or 7 months. That's not abnormal. It's not considered a drought here.
Yeah.
Here at this area, Pescadero, the rainy season might start mid to late October and end in May. I've been here at TomKat for 6 years. The average rainfall officially is 29 inches for this area, which sounds like quite a bit of rain. But if you think of a lot of it's coming down during the very cold months when there's not a lot of daylight, especially January, February, March, your grass does not grow a lot during those months. In the 6 years I've been here, our rainfall has ranged from as low as 14 to as much as 38, even though our average is 29. So managing for it, the way I approach it is every day, I don't care what day of the month, what day of the year, you need to manage the land to leave it so it's prepared for the very next rainfall. Because you actually don't know how much you're going to get, how intense, how long it's going to last. 2 years ago, we had a total of 14 inches during the entire rainy season. This year, as of today, we're already at 28 inches. And we still have till May. And what we don't know is the way these erratic weather patterns have become. Is it going to turn off as it did last year? Last year, we were doing really well until January. It stopped raining. And then we only got 3 inches between January and June, and we almost ran out of grass because of that. Our growing season was very short. We don't know if that's going to happen again this year. So the key to managing in this kind of a climate is to have your soils prepared so they can infiltrate as much water as they can when it rains, and then retain it, hold it. And that really requires having very porous land and land that's very high carbon so that the soils have the ability to hang on to that water.
And so how do you actually do that?
A variety of tools. The main one we're using on this landscape is grazing animals. Our main animal has been cows for a number of years, although we've introduced goats now. not only to have a more biodiverse livestock on the land, but to utilize more of the plants that grow here. And the way you do it with livestock is, number one, things you don't do. So one of the things you don't do is you don't set stock graze where you leave animals in a pasture until everything is consumed and then move them out. You will create bare soil. You will create plants with short roots, and you will minimize, or you will reduce the ability of that soil to infiltrate water. What you can do, and it's not all year round, but at certain times, the higher the density the animals are, the more they will eat all the plants, the higher concentration of manure and urine they leave behind, which causes the plants to grow more vigorously. And the more trampling you get, those plants that aren't eaten are trampled. Those parts of the plant that are edible, or plants they like that they don't prefer at that time of the plant stage, they trample, and incorporating that carbon back into the soil, or letting the microbes break it down and incorporate it. All of that builds your soil organic material.
And so when you talk about avoiding short roots or shallow roots in the soil, you want deep roots in the soil. And part of that is perennial grasses and native grasses. When you started, and when TomKat really started trying to regenerate the ranch, the land on which you're grazing cattle, did you have already a lot of native grasses? Like, how has that changed, and how are you really managing for particular grasses?
So today we have some pastures that have native perennial grasses, and we have some pastures that do not have any. And how we got there, I'll explain in a minute. We do only have one seed plot trial that we did that UC Davis wanted to do a seed plot trial here with native seeds. It's 1 6-acre pasture, and that is the only place we've actually intentionally planted native perennial grasses. I'm a believer in giving the native perennial grasses every opportunity to come back, but more I'm a believer in looking for the plants that are adapted to the current environment. I'm not sure that this land, as much as it was farmed, the mechanical damage that was done to it and possibly the chemical damage that was done to it, that these soils today are what the native perennials want to grow in. If we create the environment, I think they will grow, because we've seen this in some places. In 2010, when they first put together their grazing plan, the management at that time was just learning about planned grazing, and they put together a plan with Point Blue, and they divided the ranch up into 75 pastures. At that time, when they did a survey, they could only detect native perennials in 8 of those 75 pastures. And that was in 2011. 2 years later, in 2013, when they resurveyed, they could detect perennial native grasses in 55 of those 75.
Wow.
Now, that was without chemicals, planting, mowing. Nothing happened differently, but they started moving the cows. And I think what happened was it allowed the perennial natives to get a break from the cows and allowed them to express themselves, put the roots down and put their heads up and grow. They're a little slower growing than your annuals that come on really fast in the fall. That was in 2013, forward through the drought of 2014-15 to 2018. When we redid the survey, we are now up to, the last survey in 2018, we're now up to 70 of 75 of our pastures we can detect native perennial grasses. And again, that is without planting them. That is just giving them the opportunity. Some things we've noticed in some fields, if you overgraze at a certain time of the year and then leave a long recovery, you can actually see, especially purple needlegrass, I believe that's called Stipa pulchra, it will actually germinate and come on quite strong. Now you have to leave it a long recovery, and you are making some bare soil in the progression of that. But in some fields, we've actually had really good success with the native perennials appearing.
That's so interesting and kind of counterintuitive.
Well, yes and no. What we don't know, and I wonder about, is if some of the big herds that used to come through here, let's say elk. So if a big herd of elk is moving through here 500 years ago, the last 100 elk don't say, "Oh, I'm not going to eat any of that grass. It's overgrazed." They're going to take it, and they're going to take it down hard. The thing is, they may not come back for a year or two. I think about this. If you go on the internet and look at the wildebeest that still, the big herds of wildebeest that still migrate in Africa. In the dry season, sometimes it's a dust bowl. In the rainy season, sometimes it's a mud hole. And yet it comes back because they give the land plenty of recovery time. And I am not sure how much our overgrazing, overgrazing sometimes is not as how hard you graze it, it's how little you allow the plant to recover. So the harder you graze it, the longer you must allow it to recover. We, with our property lines, our barbed wire fences, and our need for production, get caught with taking too much, coming back too soon.
Yeah, interesting. Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So in a sense, the land is adapted to overgrazing. As you say, all these herds of elk come through, and then they say, oh, that stuff's overgrazed. We're not going to go back for a while, and the land recovers. And so that's part of the natural cycle. I'm making a guess at this, but it may well be. I mean, I used to work in the redwood region in Northern California in the timber. And if you look at some of those trees, the issue wasn't people cutting redwood trees, is that they circled back on that forest every 20 to 30 years. If they had taken their first cut and come back 500 years later, it wouldn't have been a big issue. But the problem was production, and we kept circling back and cutting the trees harder and harder. And it's just on a bigger, if you think about a redwood tree like a perennial grass, we just kept coming back and taking more and more instead of allowing a full recovery. It's no different than us working out at the gym. If you do not allow your muscles to recover, eventually something's going to break down. Yeah, that's an interesting analogy. So you've got these perennial plants and native grasses that are growing back. Do you see, as a result of that, better water infiltration into the soil holding more water?
I can't point at any science on this place yet that we could show that. I don't have the numbers to back it up. I can tell you anecdotal stories of, for instance, last fall, we had a major weather event here that dumped 8 inches of rain really early in October. It was what they call a pineapple express. It came out of the southwest and off the ocean and ran really warm. We did not get any runoff in our culverts until after 6 inches of rain. So you're getting this major storms coming in, dumping water, and it's just, the land is just soaking it up and it's not running off. Currently we've had almost 2 weeks of straight rain here. Yes, do we have runoff now? Yes. So going back to, we show high infiltration rates. We do have the challenge of legacy farming on some of this ground. When you go out there with a penetrometer, which is a probe you push into the soil to measure the resistance, you will find somewhere between 12 and 16 inches in some of these fields, what they call plow pan. It is a compressed layer from legacy farming where moldboard plows were run. And especially when the clay is wet, it squeezed it down. And so now you've got this impenetrable layer in there that water doesn't pass through very well. Roots could not pass through very well. And so that does impact our infiltration. The other thing is we have, in some fields, we have very shallow topsoil. We can have less than 12 inches. Whether that's natural or that's the result of past farming, I'm not sure. There are a lot of, not just on this land, but there's a lot of the similar issues on surrounding lands, and our creeks do have a lot of sediment that has moved off these hills. So trying to figure out cause and effect here is a little difficult, but we do know that having deeper rooted plants tends to break up the soils, open them up, give you more pores to allow more water infiltration.
Can those deep-rooted plants get through that, what did you call it, plow pan?
Some yes, a lot no. From what I've read, about 200 pounds per square inch, roots slow down, stop penetrating at 300 pounds per square inch, they're done. Thistles, this is where your quote-unquote weeds come in. Thistles can break up plow pan, can break up soil up to 800 pounds per square inch. So actually thistles in the fields, depending on what's going on, is not a bad thing. That thistle grows, especially an annual thistle, it grows, it dies, it leaves a hole. whether it's microbes moving down through the hole, earthworms, water. And then fungi, as I understand, fungi can break up soil up to 1,500 pounds per square inch. So a lot of your other, what we think of non-pasture plants, animals, flora and fauna are doing the work. And that's one of the big things we look for here at TomKat is biodiversity. We definitely do not want a monoculture. A lot of our pastures, when they've done the species count, were somewhere between 20 and 60 different species of plants. Maybe not all of them are forage. I don't necessarily have a problem with that because maybe they're contributing to just the health of the soil.
For people who aren't involved with agriculture or land management, it's kind of not intuitive, but the soil seems to be the best place to actually store water. Explain how that works. Like, why is the ground better at storing water than, say, reservoirs?
I'm glad you asked that question because a lot of times when I talk to urban folks, I like to ask them to think about when they turn on the faucet, where does the water come from besides the water company? How does the rainfall wind up coming out your tap in your house? These are rough numbers, but if you raise your soil organic matter 1% in an acre, you can hold approximately 20,000 gallons more water. And an inch deep of water over an acre is approximately 27,000 gallons. So 20,000 gallons is like a 3/4 inch rainfall. So if you think about just from an agricultural point of view, at the end of the rainy season, if you've increased your land organic matter by 1%, you got an extra 3/4 inch of rain at the very end of the season, which when it's the most valuable, extends your growing season, especially in pastures. Where that helps urban folks is that's water that has infiltrated into the soil. It's going to move down through that profile of the soil. And some of it's going to come out in streams, through springs, into streams, then into rivers. And some of it's going to move down into the aquifer. I mean, we have a major problem around the world. You know, in the United States, one of the big ones in the Midwest is the Ogallala, I can't pronounce it very well. Ogallala. There, thank you. Aquifer that is being overpumped. The Central Valley here in California, there are pictures from sometime in the 30s to now where they are seeing numerous feet of farmland has dropped, not eroded, just dropped compared to, say, telephone poles and fence lines. And that is because we're over pumping the aquifers. That water, a lot of times, is what ultimately supports urban life. And so it's everybody's benefit how we manage the water out on the land, especially the rangeland. They say in the world, more rain lands on rangeland than any other type of soil. And so for the benefit of society, we really should be looking at how we manage water out on the rangeland.
Because then so much more water is available not only to the ranchers and farmers, but to the people who need it in the cities. Correct.
If you think about a lot of the flooding that's going on in California right now, a lot of this is due to we have channelized our streams. We have put up levees. Every time you put sides on water, you speed it up. And if you speed it up enough, when you bring enough of those together, there's no place for the water to go. So when it breaks out, it floods. A lot of streams used to be meandering, used to be floodplains. Most of the places that flood nowadays were floodplains a long time ago. And when you've taken that ability of the floodplain away, you've taken the ability of the water to take its time to infiltrate and for the water to drop out the minerals, the sediment, the fertility, and build those rich farmlands again. So there's a value in dams and reservoirs, yes, but only to build those and not actually pay attention to how our water cycle works, because those are not part of the natural water cycle, is not going to solve our water problems.
So how do you think, I mean, especially given the flooding that you are seeing as we speak in California, how do you think that managing for healthy soil on public lands, on agricultural lands in California, how could that be done better to actually deal with, like if they were doing that, how would the flooding you're seeing today look different?
Well, one of the things, so if you started with farmland, one of the things that if we have programs that either incentivized or did not disincentivize, which some of our programs do, no bare soil. In other words, as much as you can cover crops of multi-species, not just a monocover crop, to keep that soil open, to have it as bare as little as possible. Some people have become incredibly innovative in being able to seed before they harvest one crop. They've already seeded the other. On our rangelands, not overgrazing, to creating policies that incentivize us to leave the land in the best way to infiltrate water. Just recently, the last week, I drove up the coast to Half Moon Bay, 20 miles north of here. And along the way, you see some channels across farmland. It's not even that steep a gradient, where it's a foot deep and 5 feet wide. The topsoil's gone. It's moved off down the field. That is fertility we're not going to get back in our lifetime. And we are actively losing this. And the sad part is we actually know it, but not all of our policies, the way we manage water, for instance, trying to work on streams is really problematic with permitting. And a lot of our water management is toward getting the water off the land rather than storing the water or slowing the water down. Think about permaculture. Slow it, spread it, sink it. The other one I think about a lot is in America, we talk about watersheds, the water being shedded, moved off. Australia, who is water poor, talks about catchments. They want to catch every bit of water. We really need to rethink how we manage our water because, frankly, we've been very wasteful. In the Midwest to the East Coast, we've had plenty of water. In the West, we've done a great job with our irrigation systems. But as our climate changes, wherever we want to put the blame on why the climate's changing, it's changing. We're seeing less snow, and we're seeing more erratic rainfall patterns and more intensity. Therefore, you need to do a better job managing to hang on to that water.
One of the things I think is really interesting with respect to those kind of changes is when you talk about restoring a farm or a ranch or restoring any ecosystem or piece of land, it's hard to know what you're restoring to. Like, are you restoring to sometime 500 years ago, but the land isn't the same as it was 500 years ago?
Completely agreed. I like to joke that, a lot of people genuflect at the altar of carbon, and I don't, because I think carbon is a legacy. I should say carbon in the soil, or sequestered carbon. It's a legacy of good management over a number of years. Your actions today, you can destroy the carbon in the soil and release it through tillage. But you can't do a lot about sequestering carbon. But you can be very active about how you manage the water. And the water leads to plant growth. And through that photosynthesis, because the water exists, then the plants can sequester carbon.
Right.
So I think the key is around managing the water, and that will address a lot of our issues.
Another tool for managing water is beavers. Do you have beavers on the ranch?
No, we do not. Very interested in them. Fascinating in California. I don't know if the laws have changed, but until lately it was illegal to transport beavers, but it wasn't illegal to get a depredation permit and have them taken out because they're considered a pest. If you go back in historical records, beavers were here in California. A lot of our streams and the way the hydrology worked here was due to beavers. Beavers, I think, get a big knock because they cause flooding. But if you look around the world where people have learned to live with them, it's like anything. You can have beavers. You just can't let them exist unmanaged. And when I say managed, I'm not talking about trapping them. I'm talking about allowing them to build their dams and then manage how high those dams go or how much water it holds. They're nature's engineers that really develop the water, especially in the western part of the United States.
Is that something that ideally you would hope to have on the ranch?
Oh, if I could pull that off someday, I would be very interested in doing that. Very interested.
Yeah. One of the things that I think is really interesting and kind of important to talk about is the idea of waste, because for the kind of industrial mentality, you don't want to waste anything. You want to make sure every single thing that you have gets used. And one of the examples that you talked about, I think during the Regenerate conference, was you were doing bale grazing, and some of the hay was quote unquote wasted, meaning it wasn't eaten, but it was actually doing a lot of good. Talk about that and like what that looked like.
Yes, waste. I don't believe in waste. I believe that the byproduct from one activity should become the ingredient for another activity. You just have to be creative. So in bale grazing, we adopted this idea looking around the Midwest and up into Canada, and they do this during the snow season. Generally, the ground's frozen. They put out big bales, 1,000-pound round bales, and feed cattle. And they generally leave behind 20 to 30%, which could be called waste. But in reality, it's trampled. It's inoculated very highly with urine and manure, lots of microbes. And then in the springtime, when the soil thaws and the rains come, all that material breaks down and grows grass very well. Here in California, with our Mediterranean climate, we flipped it around. We realized if we tried to do that in the wintertime, we would destroy our clay soils. They're very soft right now. And of course, the bales couldn't sit out in the field very long. So we actually do our bale grazing late summer, early fall, right before the rain. So we try to target September, October. We put them on a pattern of about 30-foot centers. And yeah, we quote-unquote waste 20 to 30%. But that wastage is actually feeding the microbes and feeding the soil. This year is our third year of doing it. We've actually set up one of our trials with Point Blue now to study what is going on in the soil from both the water infiltration, carbon sequestration, microbes, plants. We've done some plant intersects to see what will happen over time. The first trial I did was just what they call a safe to fail. I put out this 3 years ago. I put out some bales, only did it for less than a week. Let it have 4 months of rest and recovery, which wasn't enough, but it was a good place to start. When I checked the water infiltration, it had gone up 500 or 600%. That got me a little bit excited because this was a field that was a high ridge, had been farmed up until 2010. Pictures of the soil, it literally looks like a brick. And for the water to be able to improve that much with that short a time. And then the production, we saw massive growth of ryegrass. Now, ryegrass is not the end all, but we had not planted ryegrass there. We had not seen ryegrass very much in the rest of the field. Our initial measurements showed about a 400% increase in production. So those two numbers got me a little excited and said, okay, we need to repeat this on a bigger scale and then start to study it.
You just mentioned a concept called safe to fail, and I'd love it if you would talk about that idea.
Safe to fail. I got that idea from an Australian gentleman named Graham Hand. If you go on and look him up on the internet, he's got a lot of stuff he shares.
Yeah, we had him on this podcast once. He's amazing.
Excellent. Yeah. Yes, Graham is. The way I understand safe to fail, there's two things going on. One, you need to do enough things so that 12 months from now, you know something more than you do now, or you're not going to move ahead. Sometimes that's knowing what not to do is as important as knowing what will work. And then doing things, a variety of things, and doing them small enough that if every one of them fails, it will not have any impact on your operation. That's the safe part. I've had some people say, don't call it fail. It's safe to learn. It's semantics, whatever you want to call it. I just think that you should be every year, you should be trialing some really out of the box, something that's really goofy, something that maybe quote unquote shouldn't work, and just see if it does. And some of the things we've tried have worked very well in some fields and some haven't. And then we've had to back up and learn from those where they will and won't work.
Talk about some of the things that have worked that you tried in that way.
Okay, so bale grazing worked. The other one was an idea adopted called swath grazing. Again, it's more of a Midwest thing where they will cut, you might say grain hay or grass or hay, just cut it with a hay cutter, leave it in a windrow. It freezes and they strip it off during the winter. I understand, cows that are well trained can eat through up to about 2 feet of snow. And where we've used it here is we have a introduced perennial grass called harding grass that will continue to grow after the rainy season to the point of where it becomes unpalatable. And over time, it will start to shade out the rest of the field, and so it becomes a monoculture, and it really takes over. And what I have found so far is we can go in and cut this grass in a pasture that's dominated by harding grass. We can go in there and cut it in, say, June. It still has decent feed quality. Leave it in the swath, let it dry. With our fogs here on the coast, sometimes it'll get a little blackish on the outside, a little mold. But if you open up on the inside, it smells like good hay. We're not spending the money to bale, to haul, to do anything else. And then we come back in August, September when everything is dried out here, and we strip it off just like pasture. And is the only time we've been able to graze our cattle in a harding-dominated field in August and September and have the cows actually content. Because to me, part of the thing is to have an animal content, especially when you're grazing at high densities. We've seen them very content, move them 2 or 3 times a day, have them fill up and lay down, have them gain well, and then ultimately the next spring see the biodiversity of the pasture change dramatically. Because what we've done is we've reset the field. When the hay cutter went through, we held it up about 6 or 8 inches. We didn't want to take it real short, but all of a sudden we've allowed daylight down there for a lot of different, let's say, annual plants to germinate, and slower perennial plants are there to grow that the harding was dominated, wasn't allowing. So I felt that we got the benefit from both the livestock production and improving the land.
You know, it's so interesting to listen to you because, I mean, you grew up on a dairy farm. You have been working in agriculture all of your life. You worked in Guatemala. You worked in New Zealand. You've done all kinds of things in agriculture and ranching. And at the same time, here you are, like, learning new things all the time. It just seems like an endless journey of learning.
Oh, it has to be. I think I got lucky that I grew up on a place that was probably even considered a little backward then, because we didn't have barns. Our cows, yes, it was Northern California and on the coast, so it's fairly temperate, but still the cows were outdoors 365. The only time they went in was to be milked. We had some of our equipment was old enough. I can think of a potato digger that had been horse drawn, that had been converted over to tractors. So we had some very old 1930, 1940 equipment. It was a different way of thinking about the land. At the same time, I think my father was very progressive in the way he approached things. He had a really good balance. But there was things that he knew that worked, but I'm not sure he actually knew how they worked because we didn't know enough about the soil then. You know, we didn't know about the microbes and the interaction of for instance, the bacteria and fungi ratio. There's so much we've learned in the last decade that didn't exist in his day, that knowledge, or even when I went to college in the 80s, that didn't exist. So I think anybody that's out on the land that isn't constantly learning and then thinking about the context they work in and how that new knowledge applies is not taking advantage of the opportunities we have today.
I mean, you're working with Point Blue Conservation Science. Tell us a little bit about them and how you're working together and some of the things that you're learning from that collaboration.
Well, when I first got here, one of Point Blue's people was based out of TomKat. She worked on other ranches, but she was also based out of TomKat. And Mel did a lot with the birds. I really learned a lot about grassland birds. I knew nothing about them. And it really taught me a lot about using birds as an indicator species. Some of the things that we learned from each other was, at that time, the thought was that you didn't want to graze the grassland areas where the birds nested during the nesting season. Yet we realized over time that if you always left them, then the grass was very tall, and some of those grassland birds do not like 2-foot tall grass. So having a mosaic, if you think about the wildlife, for instance, in the Midwest, bison, when they used to move through the Midwest, they didn't walk by the grassland and say, we're not going to graze because it's grassland birds. They grazed it, and the birds found where they fit in. Some of these birds like taller grass. Some of them like really bare area. So creating a mosaic was really good. And those were things I learned from them. Chelsea Carey, who's their head soil person, She and I started both about the same time. We learned a lot from each other how to set up trials. We joke about this, but the very first trial we went to do, I believe Chelsea wanted to do like 1 meter square plots. And I'm thinking a cow can't even stand in that. And I was clear off the chart. On the other end, I wanted to do 50 acres, which was absurd also for a trial. I had no idea what I was getting into. And we came back to where we're like, oh, reality is we can do a 1 acre trial where we do applications, and then we have a 10 by 10 meter plot where we actually do sampling internally. So understanding the realities of working on the ground combined with what scientists need to be able to run trials and understand things has been really helpful. I really appreciate Point Blue's approach in that they don't operate on reductionist science where you drill down to one thing, because out here in nature, you just can't do that. You can't hold variables. Everything's a variable. So you have to learn to work within the scope of what the context is. And that has been incredibly valuable, not only when I'm working with them, but just to think about the land and the animals as we're managing on a daily basis.
You personally are committed to regenerative agriculture, as is TomKat Ranch, as, a whole entire system. What do you think it would take to really scale up regenerative agriculture in your area, just because of all the things you've mentioned? I mean, flood and drought control and bringing health back to the soil, which sequesters carbon, and building topsoil and things like that. So what would it take for more people to do it so that it became kind of the dominant system in California, and what's in the way?
That's a good question, but that's a huge one. I mean, California, we're so diverse in our landscapes. If you think about these rangelands and these coastlands, one of the things people have tried to do is go finish grass-fed beef to get a higher return for their time and per acre. I think that's a good thing, but we also have lack of infrastructure. Slaughterhouses has stood in the way of making that practical. I also think that we need to be looking at other species. A lot of this land here on this coast doesn't really speak to me as cattle ground. A lot of it speaks to me of sheep and goat, or possibly different breeds of cattle. We actually have brought in some African-based cattle 2 years ago to see how they do. They were developed in a more of a Mediterranean climate in South Africa, and to see how they work in this climate, if they're more adapted than our English-based Angus and Hereford breeds are. I think that every place has to look at its context and think about the economics and how to make it work. But I also think it's bigger than the farmers and ranchers. It's got to be the community as a whole. In this country, we've had a policy since at least World War II of cheap food. And in doing so, we have run a lot of agriculture, you might say, as an open pit mine. And I know I'm sounding real critical here, but we have extracted and then added more chemicals to extract more. And we haven't put back. And while that's been good as a government policy, and you might say a societal policy for cheap food for a while, it's not one we can continue to do. And so we really need to look at it, not just the farmers and ranchers, which, what are we, 1 or 2% of the population? We need to have 100% of the population really focusing on where do we get good quality food? Where do we get good quality water? What are the policies around not only land management on private lands, but public lands? I mean, if you look at the amount of public lands just in California alone that could be managed better, whether they're in our park system or in our forestry, whether it's federal or state, there's a lot of opportunity in all these areas.
One of the things that you've talked about is changing the way we think about grazing leases and really leasing public land out on the basis of who's going to do the best job managing it.
So, yeah, this may sound a little goofy, but I've always thought that, again, I go back to water. To me, is the most important. It's the most limited resource we have. If we really think about how much actually potable water is in the world, I could be wrong, but I think it's only like 3 or 4%. There's not much potable water out there, and we have polluted a fair amount of it. If rangeland was bid out based on who could infiltrate the most water, show up with whatever tool you want. You want to run pigs, chickens, cows, elephants, mow it, do nothing. The person that could do the best job infiltrating the water, slowing the runoff, does the most for whoever's downstream. And downstream is the person who is either flooded out by a large amount of runoff or the person who's tapping into the aquifer from the water that's infiltrating in those rangelands. And then anything that farmer or rancher can make off of actually managing the lands would sort of be cream of the crop. But it kind of stands our current system on its head, but we charge people to go out and graze lands, and we don't actually look at, are those lands being grazed to the benefit of the whole of society? And we really need to do that.
And that leads me to my last question, I think, which is that moving toward healthy soil agriculture really goes hand in hand with shifting our paradigms about farming and really moving out of the industrial mindset. What does that look like for you? What are some of the shifts that you've gone through in how you see and how you work?
Well, to give you an idea, I did, in my background, at one point I did work for a few of the larger poultry companies in the world, both in California, Florida, and Georgia. I actually worked for an international chemical company when I first got out of college. So I got to experience what that was like. And my eyes got open to the real shortcomings. Yeah, you can produce cheap food, but there are some real shortcomings to both the quality of the food and the impact it has on the land. We need to bring back balance. I don't think of regenerative agriculture as taking it back to something 500 or 1,000 years ago. I think about bringing back balance. For instance, thinking about how we can reincorporate animals into farmland. We have a lot of rules around food safety. And not that I want those thrown out the window, but there's a lot of studies have been done both in academia and actually out on the land, people who are actually farming and working with scientists that have showed that incorporating livestock grazing into cover crops, following cash crops, following vegetables, taking tilled land out of production for several years into pasture, whether it's dairy, whether it's beef, whether it's sheep, then rotating it back in is incredibly valuable for building soil without having to use chemicals. So you improve your water quality and your air quality, for water infiltration, for the quality of the vegetables or cash crop grains that are coming off there, and then for the meat and milk you produce. So to me, regenerative would be how do we return balance and integration? You know, we think about it in the human population, we've talked about integrating our populations more biodiverse. We need to see that out on our land. The fascinating thing is there are places around the world that have done this. And if you're familiar with that term, the hockey stick on a curve, where they will be slowly building soil organic material through, let's say, no-till and cover crop and reducing chemicals. And then all of a sudden, when they add grazing animals, it skyrockets their soil organic matter and their water infiltration. And it's back to the way nature built soils. I think about here on the coast, these were eroded beaches that got pushed up, and somehow they turned into grassland. Somehow they turned into these coastal terraces that are being farmed, have been farmed for over 100 years, that are incredibly rich. None of that was done with chemicals. None of that was done with tillage. It was all done with having a well-balanced water, mineral, and energy cycle. And we need to understand how to rebuild that and our place in that and shepherd it along.
Mark Biaggi, is there anything else that we haven't talked about that you want our listeners to know?
I'd like to throw in two things. It goes back to your question about waste. And two of the things I want to throw in, one, a lot of people want to create silvopasture today, which is going out in pastures and planting trees to create more of a savanna. Here we have an encroachment of firs, which when the indigenous folks were burning these lands, and maybe the first settlers were burning these lands, the firs, which don't like fire, were held at bay more in the ridges. And now they're encroaching across the pasture. And some places that are so thick, the firs that are growing aren't even healthy. We took two of these places and we thinned them out, we limbed them up. We tried to recreate. So rather than planting trees like people think about silvopasture, we're actually thinning trees and limbing trees to create this savanna. And yes, it did work as far as the pasture, but the byproduct of all that was not stacked and burned. We actually used that to address erosion gullies. And one of the places that's fascinating, we did this work in 18, and through all this rain we're going through right now, I was just up there last week with my boss looking at it. We've got gullies that were 20 feet deep 4 years ago, and we have raised basically the creek bed almost 20 feet. It's within 3 feet of the pasture now, where the water is moving across all this woody material, shaking out the sediment. So we've slowed the water. It's not rushing downstream as fast to cause floods. We're shaking out the sediment that's in the water to hold that sediment back and not get into the fish streams. And we've raised, you might say, the water table within that stream. So I look at these streams are no longer drains on the field. They might actually be in a position to rehydrate these fields when the rains stop. And that's all due to taking the waste product, so-called waste product from one project, and turning it into a ingredient for another project. We could have done that by hauling in boulders or buying material or hauling in waste, wood waste from somewhere else. And instead we took what we had on the land and combined two projects. And all we did was burn a little gas to cut the trees and diesel to drag them over, and a little brain power to think about how to create sediment traps and how to properly place all that material in these erosion gullies. And I think if we can look across our landscape of America or around the world and ask ourselves, what is the byproducts we're producing today? How much quote unquote green waste goes to landfills that should be reincorporated out on the landscape somewhere in some form to manage water, to sequester carbon, to build fertility, we might actually start making more progress. The other piece was the fact of part of what I'm looking at now is this is working well enough that, we have a lot of eucalyptus that was planted here in California, but was brought over from Australia. It's not native, and it really takes over in these thick groves. And when they burn hot, they explode. And eucalyptus are very hard to kill. You can cut them down, they sprout, come right back. So unless you're going to use poisons, you're not going to get rid of them. But we're in an area that's really rock poor. And so I'm viewing these eucalyptus more of you might call it my regenerative rock pit. If I cut them down big, and I've done this in several places where I need riprap for culverts to be energy dissipators, and instead we've cut down some eucalyptus and used the logs, piled the logs in there and used them to become an energy dissipator. And by the time the logs have broken down, we have so much willow growing in there, the stream is very stable. Again, we're taking a potential issue of a high fuel load, an explosive tree that's invasive, removing it and turning it into something that can solve other problems for us and not have to, expend diesel to haul things in, pollute more in the air, burn more carbon in the process. And so how do we tie one project into another so these projects are feeding each other? Because if we think about how nature works, there is no waste. Everything is eaten in nature, and everything that eats something eventually dies and is eaten by something else. There's a constant circle. And we seem to be the only thing that doesn't understand that. Nature does not have landfills and dumps. It is constantly being composted and recycled. And we need to figure out how to do that. And those are just two small things we've done here on the ranch.
Mark Biaggi is ranch manager at TomKat Ranch. They are on the web at TomKat, that's cat with a K, K-A-T, tomkatranch.org. Thank you for being with us.
Thanks for the opportunity to talk to you. Much appreciated.
You've been listening to Down to Earth, We would love it if you would support this program, which you can do by going to patreon.com/down-to-earth planet to plate, where you can sign up for as little as $3. Patreon is Patreon. And also please rate and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. The Quivira Coalition is a not-for-profit and a community network of ranchers, farmers, conservationists, scientists, educators, and many others dedicated to regenerative practices that produce healthy food, support meaningful livelihoods, sustain biodiversity, and remedy the impacts of climate change. To learn more about Quivira and how you can support their work, visit quiviracoalition.org, Quivira. And finally, this show is a production with the Radio Cafe. You can check out radiocafe.org to hear back episodes of this show and also find all kinds of other shows on a wide variety of topics as well. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.